Welcome to our fifth in the series on characters of faith. It's an opportunity for us to think about characters in the Bible, how they live their lives, and how we too can learn from their lives with God. The reality is each and every character has something different to say, and so often, although we're known by God, our names aren't big or known by anyone else. And so today we're going to focus on a servant girl. A servant girl whose name is not known, but by her simple action, a miracle of God occurred. And so let's begin our story by turning to 2 Kings, chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who's in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." I want us to note a couple of things. Naaman was an amazing commander of the army. Why? Because the Lord had gifted him. He wasn't from Israel, he was from another country, and yet you can see already that God is in charge. But it introduces our second character, this slave girl. She'd already been stolen in one of these raids. She'd had to leave her family. She'd had to leave everything behind, and she now was a servant to Naaman's wife. She had every reason in the world to absolutely hate Naaman, to absolutely not want to help in this new situation. But what does she do? She, along with so many of God's people, goes, how can I be used? What can I do? And so she says to Naaman's wife, if only Naaman would go and see the prophet in Israel, in Samaria, the prophet Elisha. And so we have these two characters, first of all. We have this unnamed servant girl taking a risk and saying, if only. And we have Naaman, this amazing commander, who seems to have the hand of God upon him, but he has leprosy. And leprosy was a symbol of someone that was outcast, symbol of someone who shouldn't connect with others. But Naaman decides to do it. He decides to go and visit the king of Israel. And the king of Israel immediately thinks, oh no, here's a troublemaker. We're starting a war. This is an excuse for someone. What's going to happen? The king of Israel does not have any trust in God. He doesn't have any faith in God. He immediately thinks it's a trick. It's a ruse. But Elisha, the prophet of God, hears. And he says, hey, I'm up for helping. I'm going to send a message. This is what's going to happen. And so the king of Israel sends Naaman off to the prophet Elisha. And the prophet Elisha, well, what does he do? He doesn't even go and meet Naaman. This really annoys Naaman. And the prophet even then goes, why don't you just go and wash in this river? And immediately Naaman is so annoyed. His pride is so big. His pride is so there. It's almost like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stoop so low as to wash in this dirty river just down the road. Because back in my hometown, there are beautiful bars and beautiful rivers. If it was that simple, that's what I'm going to do. And so he was about to walk off in a storm. But again, his servants say, hang on, mate, it's not that hard. Why don't you just do this simple thing? Why don't you just humble yourself and put the word of God to test? And so he does. He goes and bathes himself. And immediately he is healed of leprosy. And he goes back. And he goes back to Elisha and says, wow, this is amazing. Thank you. So in verse 15, Naaman just wants to give to Elisha, to recognize that this God is the true God, to recognize this is the only God to have faith in. And Elisha says, no, go back home, talk about the real God, and go in peace." And so Naaman goes home in peace. You'll see in the story, if you wanted to follow it further, that Elisha's servant then tries to trick him and ends up getting leprosy for himself. But you can see that by reading it in 2 Kings 5. But what I want us to really focus on is those 4 characters. First of all, Naaman, the big commander who has the hand of God on him, who simply at one point his pride might have stopped his encounter. And yet when he humbled himself to the word of God, a miracle in his life happened. You have the king of Israel, the one who should have been faithful to God, who immediately just thinks, "Oh no, I'm in trouble," rather than recognizing here's an opportunity for God to work. You have Elisha, the prophet, the one who is so confident and just shares the word of God, and God works. But all of this has only been possible by a little slave girl who had nothing to lose, who had the opportunity just to say, "Why don't you? If only you would go and see. If only you go and connect with a prophet who can point you to God." And I wonder how often God is at work in our lives, in our church and the people around us. And all he wants us to do, whether we feel like it or not, whether we've got things in the world that we would like to do or not, to just simply share, "Why don't you? If only you would go and see." For when we point people in that way, the miracles of God happen. When you look at the history of the Christian church, there are so many unsung heroes that just simply hear God's voice and simply point people to God, point people to Jesus. Just say, "Why don't you?" And miracles happen. This week, in the days to come, why don't you find those opportunities to say to people, "Why don't you? If only. Look and see." And then step back and watch and pray. For God is at work and miracles can happen just because you said, "Why don't you?"